Good morning, 8th graders. Today, the plan is for you to take your U.S. States test. Excuse me, some or many of you have already tested out of that last week with the pretest. If you scored a 47 or above, you don't have to take the test. Otherwise, those of you that do, I'm going to give you directions at the beginning of class today before you even watch this video what you need to do. So by the time you see this, you will have already taken your U.S. States test. The purpose of this video is to allow you to have the time you need to take the states test and still be able to get some material in. So I'm going to teach a lesson on through this video and post it on YouTube so that you can see what I want you to see and we can continue to move forward. If you don't have time to get it done during class, you can do it at home. It's very simple. Video will probably be about 20 to 25 minutes and the expectation is that you do watch it. Mostly talking about the Pilgrims coming to America, the purposes for them relocating to America compared to maybe Jamestown and Roanoke, and how'd they get here. So you're probably all familiar with a little bit of the story of the Mayflower, so I'm going to go into greater detail on that. And without me giving you any specific assignment, no assignment down here, none, I need you to make sure you watch this video, and I can tell who watched it and who didn't, and I can tell how long you watched it, so I know if you've got to the end or not, to be able to answer questions for me. So you need to treat this video as if I'm going to give you a quiz at next class period over the information in the video. I'm not likely going to do that, but you need to be prepared as if I'm going to. So U.S. States test, Pilgrims coming to America, the Mayflower, all of the hardships that they go through, just like there were hardships at Jamestown and Roanoke, and be prepared. So watch the video with intent of learning something. So I'm going to go right back into the presentation where we left off on Wednesday or Tuesday and see where we're at. We were talking about Jamestown, and we talked about how it becomes the first permanent settlement. It really is the only the first permanent settlement because they continue to feed settlers into Jamestown colony. So as they're dying off, they just send more. If 25 die, they send 30, and that's what allows it to survive. But you can see, it goes through some struggles, and we do know, as we talked about on Tuesday or Wednesday, John Smith is responsible for saving the colony because he was tough. And then you went through the little virtual Jamestown simulation, which is kind of fun to see if you could survive or if your decisions help the colony survive. And we know that John Rolfe there looks like Jakey. So we didn't get to this slide, but this is kind of what we talked about towards the end and how Disney maybe has screwed it up a little bit. This is John Rolfe. It says he discovered tobacco, but he didn't really discover tobacco. He discovered a mild form of tobacco that Europeans really liked. So the Indians had been using tobacco forever, but the Europeans really didn't like it. It was very bitter and a nasty flavor, which I guess some of us believe that to be true about all tobacco even today. But Rolfe found a milder version, cultivated it, planted it in the colonies, and it took off like wildfire with the Europeans. They wanted it. Wealthy Europeans had an insatiable appetite for more American tobacco, and it grew really well in places like North Carolina and in Virginia, where the first colonies were really being established. So John Rolfe becomes a big deal. So when they go to Roanoke and when they go to Jamestown, we talked about how their goal was ultimately to find riches, gold, silver, something like that. Tobacco becomes the fuel that fires settlement in the colonies. Tobacco becomes the gold for the Englishmen or the Europeans that begin to settle in massive numbers after this because they could make gigantic profits growing a simple crop that didn't flourish in the soils in Europe. They grow it in America and it could be sold to wealthy Europeans and they could make a lot of money off of it. So no gold, no silver, no precious metals. They didn't get lucky like the Spaniards did, but they did find something that had a great deal of value in the form of tobacco. Well, Rolfe ends up marrying Pocahontas, and probably strangely and difficult for us to understand, this is a portrait of what Pocahontas looked like when Rolfe, which, by the way, that's a sweet mustache, takes Pocahontas to England. And we talked about this in class, I believe. If I missed it in class, I apologize. But while Pocahontas is in England, she's actually baptized as a Christian and given a Christian name. She becomes Rebecca Rolfe, and that's where the story on Tuesday or Wednesday runs into John Smith. So this is a little thing, kind of cute little thing, a little thought bubble. I love you, Pocahontas, and Pocahontas says, I love John Smith. So there was that mad crush thing that possibly got in between them. And Rebecca Rolfe, or Pocahontas, did die in England before she was able to return back to Jamestown. And it's a little bit of a mystery, but many people think that this guy, her husband, had something to do with that out of a fit of jealousy, that maybe she was still crushing on John Smith. So when we look at the vocab from that little section, and this would have been in the textbook had we used the textbook, but it's kind of, some of it's good for us to understand. A head right is 50 acres. So if you're a settler in Jamestown, you had to have a charter or permission to settle there. You have to be given the land by the king, because all of America had been claimed by the king and the queen. So if you're willing to take the risk, you get 50 acres. An acre is a measure of size of land. So if we want to do a simple comparison, an acre is about the size of a football field-ish. So 50 football fields of land, you could grow a lot of tobacco or a lot of corn. It was actually a significant amount of land. By today's standards, 50 acres is not all that much. It's actually a relatively small farm. So that's what you get if you're willing to take the risk. An indentured servant, okay, many of the settlers that came across could not afford passage to America. And they didn't have a sponsor. So they couldn't afford to get here, but they wanted to come here because they wanted to start a new life. So what they did is they promised themselves to be basically slaves. An indentured servant is a slave for a predetermined number of years, usually 5 to 7 years. So if I'm a wealthy Englishman and you really want to get to America, and I own a large tobacco plantation in Virginia, I might pay for your trip to America and get you there, but in return, you're not going to pay me back. You're going to work for me for a period of 5 to 7 years. At the end of that 5 to 7 years, I set you free. So it's kind of a slave, but more like a part-time slave. Now, this is a guy named John Winthrop. He's a Puritan leader. You'll understand in a minute what a Puritan is. It's a religious leader, and you also look at Section 2, the New England colonies. So we've been in Virginia, and we've been in North Carolina, at Roanoke and at Jamestown. Now we're going to go further north. So when you think of New England today, when you see those words, many of you that are sports fans think of the Patriots. And if you're a fan or a hater, you either love or hate the Patriots, it seems like. But if you know where the Patriots' home is, they're in Boston. So New England would be the area around Massachusetts and that area up in there. But as the Puritans begin to settle, these are going to be the people that we're going to come to know as Pilgrims. Leaders like John Winthrop, this is a quote. Again, he said it. We must be knit together in this work. Okay, let's break this down simply. Knit together in this work means we all got to be on the same page. We've got to work together if we hope to survive. We must delight in each other. We all got to be friends. We all got to get along. If something good happens to you, I pat you on the back and I say, good for you, congratulations. We must make others' conditions our own. What that means is, if you're suffering, I'm going to suffer with you. If you're celebrating, I'm going to celebrate with you. If I'm celebrating, I want you to celebrate with me. If I have success, I'm going to share my success. If I'm failing, you're going to help me get through it. So it's sort of all about teamwork and survival. That's the idea that the Puritans have for their colony. It's not about individualism. It's kind of a socialistic idea of how we're going to survive. You got to play together. And to a certain extent, we're pretty good about stuff like this in a small community like Blair. When tragedy strikes, if my house burns down tonight, chances are by tomorrow there will be people doing fundraisers to help me. replace my home, and replace my property. That's what he's getting at. We must make others' conditions our own. So even if you don't like me, you would feel bad that my house burned down and I lost everything. So you would help out. You might chip in some money. Maybe you give me a new couch. Maybe you give me a cardboard box that I can sleep in down under the bridge by the river. We've got to mourn together. So if something bad happens, we work it out together. Rejoice together. When something good happens, we labor and suffer together. So it's all about everything is part of the group. It's not individuality. It's together, together, together. So, most everyone is familiar with the story of the Mayflower, if for no other reason. When you're a little kid in elementary school, you study the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, but very few people know the real story of the Mayflower. So, I'm going to break it down. I'm going to go back in time a little bit. The Mayflower we think of as being full of pilgrims. Now, it kind of fits with the definition of a pilgrim. A pilgrim doesn't have to be someone on the Mayflower. It can be somebody that's making a major movement. So if you're making a pilgrimage, you're going somewhere with a purpose. In this instance, the people on board the Mayflower were not all going for a purpose necessarily. Most of the people on the Mayflower were called Puritans. They formed their own religion in England in the late 1500s or early 1600s because they didn't like the English religion. Some of the people on the Mayflower were called strangers. So like the crew of the Mayflower, they weren't particularly religious. Or there were other people that just chipped in some money to get a ride to America. But when we talk about pilgrims, we're usually talking about Puritans, a religious group from England. So when we go back and look at the reason for settlement, it had to do with religious persecution. The word persecution means to be picked on without cause. There's really no reason to pick on them. So someone who's persecuted today, maybe because of the color of their skin or because of their sex, they get persecuted. They don't get equal treatment or equal opportunity. At this time, in England in the late 1500s, a king named Henry VIII had changed the religion for a whole country. Prior to Henry VIII coming into power, England was a Catholic country, meaning everyone in England needed to practice Catholicism. They had a national religion. In America today, we do not have a national religion. You can practice whatever sort of religion you want or no religion at all, and typically you're not persecuted for it. We have the freedom of religion. It's a right that's granted to us in the Constitution of the United States with the very first Amendment. So they were Catholic. Henry VIII had a problem. He wanted to have a son. So he married a woman named Catherine of Aragon, and they had a couple of children together, but she was not giving him a son. So he's getting mad. Kings need a son because that's who's going to take over when they die or pass on the throne. So he's getting upset, and he blames Catherine of Aragon for not bearing a man-child for him. So because he's Catholic, the Catholic Church then, and even still today to an extent, really frowns upon the idea of annulment, which means just ignoring the fact that there was a marriage, or divorce, kind of like divorce. So in order for Henry VIII to get a new wife that could give him a man-child, he has to get permission from the Pope. He goes to the Pope, and the Pope says no. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. So in the Catholic Church, the hierarchy goes something like this, and I simplify things so we understand it. There's God, then there's the Pope, then there's the King, and then there's the people. And in between there are some other people that we can mix in. So Henry VIII is ticked off at the Catholic Church, so he comes home. He still wants to get an annulment or a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, so he creates his own church. He calls it the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, which still exists today also. The difference between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, in the Anglican Church, the hierarchy goes like this. There's God, then there's the King, then there's the people. So it got rid of the Pope as the leader of the church. Now the king is the leader, and he could grant himself permission to have an annulment of his marriage. Very convenient. By the way, it wasn't Catherine of Aragon's fault that they weren't having a man-child. If you know anything about genetics, and you'll probably learn this in science this year, the male is the one that determines the sex of a baby. So Henry VIII wasn't having a man-child because he wasn't contributing the Y chromosome. So it had nothing to do with her. But anyway, he got what he wanted because he switched religions. So this group of people inside England called Puritans had to practice their religion in secrecy because they didn't like the Catholic Church and they didn't like the Church of England. There was all sorts of issues, and they were being persecuted when they were found out. So the Puritans packed up and moved to Holland, the Netherlands. In 1608, they moved to Holland. By 1620, they decided they should move to a new place, full of opportunity. They called it the New Promised Land. And they decided to make themselves a pilgrimage to America where they could start a settlement where there was nobody to persecute them for practicing their religion. They wouldn't be picked on. So the leaders of the Pilgrims threw together all of their money and all of their resources and purchased the use of 2 ships. We only know about the Mayflower, but they purchased also a ship called the Speedwell, a smaller ship. The Mayflower actually had never made an ocean voyage. It had only traveled between England and France, mostly as a cargo ship selling wine, French wine into England, and then English goods back into France in trade. So they get on board the Mayflower and they sail from Holland to England, where they pick up other Puritans, and they meet up with the Speedwell. So the Mayflower and the Speedwell are going to travel together. Neither of these ships are particularly great ships, but it's expensive, so they do the best they can with what resources they've got. Now, the Speedwell and the Mayflower have plans to sail in July of 1620 from England. But shortly before they set sail, they discover that the Speedwell has a leak. So they repair the leak. You don't want to get to sea and find a leak. So it holds them back several days. It's August now. Instead of July, it's August of 1620 that set sail. They get a couple of miles from the coast, and the Speedwell has another leak. So both ships turn around. They repair the Speedwell. This time it's October before they set sail again. They get about 200 miles off the coast of England, and the Speedwell springs a third leak. So they head back to England for the final time. About 25 or 30 of the people from the Speedwell cram onto the Mayflower, bringing the total population on board this ship to about 130. The Mayflower is not a big enough ship for 130 passengers. In fact, the tallest part underneath the decks of the Mayflower, where most of the people were, was no taller than 5 feet. So anybody taller than 5 feet tall had to squat or stoop the whole time they're on board. The trip to America was about 10 weeks. The first 2 weeks was smooth sailing. Everything was good. Everything was working out well for the Pilgrims. The weather was nice. The winds were blowing them in the right direction. And then the storms began. And the Atlantic was not very happy. And they were tossed in swells that were described as being 100 feet tall. The ship had to take down its sails. In fact, at one point the mast was broken or cracked. Without a mast, they're going to perish at sea. One of the Pilgrims fortunately had purchased some materials to build houses when they got to the New World, and was able to repair the mast. So they get really lucky. They leave the Speedwell at home. It's gone. In fact, there are some people that believe that the Speedwell, the captain of the Speedwell, may have sabotaged his own ship so that he didn't have to make the journey with the Pilgrims. There was one man swept overboard during a storm, and fortunately for him, they threw him a rope. They claimed he was 12 feet below the surface when somehow he got lucky and grabbed onto the rope, and a wave tossed him back on board. One man passed away. Only one man died in this 10-week voyage of 130 people, and there was actually a baby born at sea. The baby's name would be Oceanus Hopkins. Oceanus Hopkins, that's kind of a funny name. So it's not until November 9th, 1620. So they take off in October. November 9th, 1620, they sight land. They want to sail south because they've got permission to settle in Virginia, but unfortunately, because of the timing and because of the weather, they end up in Plymouth, in what is today Massachusetts, farther north. Now, When they get there, they find out that America is a much harsher climate than what they were used to in either Holland or in England. It's much colder. They didn't bring any snowshoes. They didn't bring building materials. They had already actually eaten and consumed about half of their supplies before they even left England. So they're short-handed on everything. Starvation is imminent. They're located on the coast, and they don't even have fishing poles. They're very ill prepared for this stay in America. So for the first full winter, they stayed on the Mayflower. They didn't even get. They went on land to search and check things out a little bit, um, see what was around. But they stayed on the Mayflower. Now you got 130 men and women and children on the Mayflower. Disease was rampant. So by April of 1621, so a few months later, 46 of the 130 were dead. A third of them had passed away within a couple of months. So the conditions on board the Mayflower were horrendous and disease spread rampantly, but they didn't have a solid understanding of how disease was spread. Before they ever got off of the ship, this is kind of an interesting thing. The Pilgrims and the separatists and the strangers, whether you were religious or not, all of the men got together and they signed what was called a Mayflower Compact. A compact is an agreement among men which said, we agree to follow majority rule. We agree to do whatever it takes to make sure that the Plymouth colony is successful. So they formed a certain level of democracy. Majority rule means if there's a decision that has to be made, we got people that are in charge, but ultimately the decision should fall on the shoulders of the people. The men, in particular, are going to vote. Now, they did get super lucky. They did find a couple of caches of corn, about 10 bushels of buried Indian corn and a few sacks of beans that they stole or pilfered from the Indians. They also, somehow, out of a stroke of luck, run into this guy, Squanto, who actually speaks English. What are the chances you land in America, the hugeness of North America, and you just happen to land at a place where there's an English-speaking Indian that helps them survive, teaches them to plant native crops like maize and how to cultivate those crops. And without Squanto, and there's another Indian man, his name eludes me at this point. But Squanto, by the way, was also a little bit into trickeration. He was taking advantage of the Englishmen at the same time as he was using them to make him more powerful amongst his own tribe. So a little bit tricky situation there. So this goes back to, and we'll finish up probably with this slide today, and thank you for watching this, but the Puritans wanted to reform the Church of England. Reform just means fix it or change, not completely start over. About by 1640, 20,000 of them had moved across into Massachusetts, so large numbers, and Puritan values. These are the same kinds of things I think that people in Nebraska or in the Midwest in the United States look towards. We believe in hard work. You know, if I earn something, I got to work hard for it. In Blair, Nebraska, we're strong proponents of giving you a good, solid education to prepare you for the real world. And we practice a representative government. So when we make decisions by voting for people that we have confidence in to make good decisions for us. If you're a dissenter, if you disagree with the Puritans in Massachusetts, you're kicked out. They go start other colonies. So even though, this is kind of ironic, even though the Puritans did what they did because they were persecuted where they were also guilty of persecuting other people, like the Quakers, which will bring us into a discussion on what the Quakers were like a little bit later on. But just to give you an idea, Quakers were strange because they were so super religious that sometimes people believed they would quake while praying. They actually believed women were equal. That's sort of like today, but that certainly doesn't fit in the time period of the 1600s. And they're willing to die for their religious beliefs, so they're very devoted. And as a result of their awkwardness, at least compared to the Puritans, they're going to be persecuted. And then I got a slide with some vocab that I'd like you to get copied down. All of this stuff needs to somehow be copied over into your fill-in notes. One little section for today. Dissenter, people who disagree. And it doesn't have to be with the church. You can disagree with me and you're in dissent. Doesn't mean you're wrong. Disagreement doesn't always mean wrong. Persecute is to mistreat because of differences. Tolerance means we have to accept people with different ideas. So even though you may not like me, you have to tolerate me because you're going to be stuck in my class for the next 9 months. And a congregation's a group of people who go to the same church. Banish, forced to leave. So I covered a lot of material in a short amount of time. I don't know, probably 20 minutes, but I haven't been watching the clock as I've gone through this. Make sure you watched it all the way to the end. Make sure you're able to answer questions from today's lecture, and we'll go over some of this on Monday or Tuesday, whenever the next time is you have class. Thank you for watching. You guys have a great weekend. Hopefully you did great on your U.S. States test.